So I'm trying a new thing because some people asked me to maybe read my sermon and videotape my sermon. So I'm not preaching it because you're not here. And I just can't wrap my brain around preaching to a video screen. So I'm just going to read my sermon to you. And I haven't ever done this before. So we'll see how the technology works. Okay. So here's what I wanted to share with you this week. I'm just going to read it. Okay. Okay. So my dad's common quip is keep on keeping on. And it's what he typically says when we've come to him with a problem and need some wisdom from him and some love and support. And it's his initial and sometimes final response. And it's not because he can't think of anything else to say, because he usually does have a lot more to say and to share when we come to him. As I've told y'all before, he is the ultimate halftime pep talk coach. But oftentimes the situation does require us to just keep on keeping on. My dad's faith is very much simply boiled down to that, because he knows the truth that if we just keep on keeping on, God will help us reach the finish line. God blesses us through suffering and troubled times. God's grace moves through unexpected people and things, and if we just keep on keeping on, we will eventually see what God has been doing. Think about those days between Jesus's arrest and his resurrection. In Sione's sermon for his churches last week, he reminded us that the disciples had given up hope. When Mary Magdalene and the other women went to the tomb on Easter morning, they had absolutely no idea what God had been up to. They fully expected that they were going to tend Jesus's lifeless body for the last time. There was no ounce of hope or even a dream that he would have arisen. Talk about a surprise ending. In those 3 dark days, was God idle? No way. God allowed Jesus to descend to the darkness of death, to take our consequences, the consequences of our sin, which is death. And then the power of the Almighty Creator God brought Jesus back from death, spiritually and physically. I'm always saying that part to you to remind myself maybe, but also to remind you that it is the power of the Almighty God who created the universe that pulled Jesus up from the grave. It is that same power that is at work in your life and my life. Even when we are in our deepest darkness of despair, when we have lost hope and can see no good thing, God is at work. The grace of God is always making something amazing happen. God never stops being creative and good. Remember my story last week about planting the church when I felt completely ill-equipped and overwhelmed? Remember that I shared how broken I felt and how I felt like such a failure? I am still learning from that experience, and I'm still using what I learned. Out of that church planting, 5 people received their call to ministry. 5 people. And I continue to be involved in mentoring those people, and all of them were women. And who knows who else will eventually answer a call to ministry because of that little church planting experience. At one point, our congregation was 1/2 children, and many of those were unescorted by adults. There was one family of children that I particularly remember. There were 5 children in that family, 8 years old and under, and each one had a different father. The great-grandmother was raising them, and as they got older and more wild, she was overwhelmed, losing control, and suffering financially. Unbeknownst to us, she had made the decision to give them over to the state, had already called them, and had set a date for that to happen. But then, that's my dog. But then we began to get to know her. We knew the children already because they'd been coming to church, especially on Second Sunday Fun Days, when all of the children stayed after worship and had lunch and adventures, or we just crafted, or just had wild, fun playtime with the pastor, me. We started making simple white bread turkey sandwiches and baking cookies on Tuesdays, and we would meet the buses on the corner where our church was. 4-year-olds through high schoolers would get off the buses at our church, and we knew that children were always hungry when they got home from school. So we also knew that 99% of those kids, probably really 99%, are coming home to either empty homes or homes where drugs and alcohol had their caregivers in an angry stupor. So there we were, just a faithful handful of us. The oldest was in her 90s, and she helped me make 40 sandwiches each week, standing up, bending over a table, putting mayo and turkey on all those sandwiches. So we met the great-grandmother of these 5 children because she was one of the very few who actually came out of the house to get the kids when they got off the bus. And we started loving and supporting her and tutoring the children. We redid the library and made half of it into this bright, beautiful place for children to read. And we opened it up each afternoon. The renovation was actually an Eagle Scout project for a Boy Scout. And those 5 children in that one family and many others began to come to the library and read. They would sometimes take books home. And then they would stay and do their homework with us. And the great-grandmother called the state back and agreed to keep the children because we were helping her with our love and support and encouragement. She felt that she could manage. To this day, I can walk down those streets and children 2 and 3 blocks away will call out my name and come running. Imagine if I had never said yes to planting that church. Imagine if I had given up when I didn't feel that I was enough. Hard times don't last forever, and God's grace is always at work, doing amazing things and turning all bad times to good in some way. Last week when I shared this difficult time in my life, what things came to mind? Do you remember seeing a light at the end of any of those tunnels while you were in the midst of the darkness? There are moments in all of those times in our lives where we can see evidence of God's grace at work if we're looking. The scriptural text this week illustrates that there's no limit to where God's blessing can come from. Moabites were considered to be the enemies of God's people, of the people of Israel. The Bible tells us that the Moabites were outside of God's blessing. This is also one of the few texts where women are the central characters of the story, and one of only 2 books in the Protestant Bible that's named after women. Pushing past the pressures of society, Ruth, a Moabite woman, makes a bold choice and takes control of her life. The text shows us how God works through human agency and human action. So human choices and human action. After her husband's death, remember that Ruth chooses to remain faithful to her mother-in-law, Naomi. This was an uncomfortable choice because it required her to live away from her family and her culture. She chooses to glean in the fields to feed both herself and Naomi. And by grace, she finds a protector known specifically as a kinsman redeemer. You may remember that term from either last year or the year before when I preached on Ruth, and you may remember what that means. But she finds this kinsman redeemer that eventually becomes her husband, Boaz, who was impressed by Ruth's bravery and faithfulness. By grace, this time of suffering becomes a blessing as Ruth becomes a part of Jesus's lineage. Through Ruth, Naomi's steadfast companion, Naomi was nourished in her old age. She began to care for Ruth's baby, Obed, and through that, her life turned sweet. While Naomi suffered the loss of her husband and sons, as well as the security and meaning that family structure carried with it in her society. Through God's work in unexpected ways and relationships, Naomi found new joy and meaning in her relationship with Ruth and Ruth's family. This joy, particularly the joy of the presence of a baby or a child and being able to care for that child, that joy enables transformation from bitterness back to the sweetness and fruitfulness of life for Naomi. Now I want to pause right here and I want to plant a seed in the back of your mind. Please remember as you move into Aurora's future that life, or more specifically for a church, ministry with children begets joy. And joy begets transformation and fruitfulness. Please remember that. That was some work that I was going to be doing with you guys as I completed my doctorate. But I'm just going to plant that seed for you and hope that you'll remember that connection between ministry with children and joy and transformation. So back to the sermon. In moments when you think that you are out of reach and that God cannot see you, much less help you, beyond the point of refuge, God's grace can still reach you. God's grace can still reach all of us, and very often in totally unexpected and unimagined ways. How are you seeing God work in your life this week? How can you reframe your focus on dark places in your life to see the grace of God's light shining, God's grace working in your life? Naomi's life, in the depths of darkness and bitterness, took a major turn because Ruth walked alongside her and supported her. This week, think about someone who has journeyed with you in a difficult time and reach out to them and thank them for being the light in your dark tunnels. Show your gratitude for God's grace working through them in your own life. And then consider, who is God calling you to be a Ruth to walk alongside and to support them? Even though we may still be struggling through our own difficulties, God is nevertheless calling us to walk alongside one another. You remember that Ruth was a widower. And she was going through that difficult time of having to leave her family and her culture. She made that choice, and that was not easy or comfortable. But even in the midst of her difficult time, she chose to walk with another. And that brought the light of Christ, the light of God's grace, into the life of another. So as we wrap up this sermon series, next week I'll start something new. Let's remember that there is always something that we can do when we don't know what to do. There is always a next right thing that can help us in our darkness and help others when we stay in relationship. In my dark times, I can look back and see that God has given me just the right people to encourage me and give me wise counsel and speak God's truth to me when the world seems to be telling me something else. And frankly, sometimes the next right thing really is simply just to keep on keeping on, knowing that God's grace is at work. Now that is something to celebrate.